Awesome. So a couple of minutes late, but we are now live on YouTube. If you refresh that page, you should be able to see yourselves pop up.
Can't see my face.
You'll have to click play, make sure that your audio is muted. You don't want that feedback. So feel free to add yourselves to the meeting notes doc. If I could get a volunteer to take notes, that'd be great. I know Roy has helped out in the past. Can you help out again? If not,
no, I think you actually take the best notes of any of us.
I can try to. I think Isaac's volunteering me to do it myself.
No. I was volunteering Daniel actually.
Yeah. Sure,
I can do it.
Okay.
Awesome, that's great. So everybody should have access to that doc. So again, I'll sort of dive in here to the agenda, go in quickly to some housekeeping notes, desired outcomes, and because today the agenda was actually partially automated, there is quite a few items, so we may not get through everything today, but I think that there's a number of things on here that are pretty high touch or low touch. Should be super simple to maybe key up some do's or actions to circle back on conversations that have been had on our various projects. So again, housekeeping here, the point of this call is to ideally interact with the community, bubble up the work that we're doing on our team here at NPM, get eyes on any work that the community wants us to be working on, essentially just a place for us to be having some more open conversations. Desired outcomes are obviously that we're moving forward with RFCs, and we're working on the right things that are going to service that community as best we can. So I want to quickly dive into the next sort of agenda item, sort of number 2. I posted an issue after our last call and added a poll for changing the time. I know that Jordan Harbin has said that he would love to join these calls. Wesley Todd, who also works on package maintenance working group and works with the Express team, has also said that he's would like to join. We've had those folks at different points jump onto these calls. It does seem that people would potentially like to change the time and day. And what I'm proposing here is that we shift at least one of the calls that we do each month, because we're sort of on a bi-weekly cadence, to a 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then we propose another set of times for another time slot that might be able to capture another audience. And that way we will have essentially a rotating time slot. So if some folks can't make it in the one day of the week, then ideally they can jump on the next time as the time would be different. So if do any folks have any points on that, or do you agree with that? Does that sound good?
Seems fine.
Okay, so I'll take that as an action item essentially I'll close out that initial poll. We'll update the date, or sorry, the time of our next call to be 2 p.m. Eastern, as it was the one that was most voted on. And I'm going to start another poll to decide if we want to run the second biweekly each month to be either on a different day and a different time, or what have us. So I'll take that on. Okay, moving on. So the way that I was able to actually generate this RFC agenda, I took some cues from the Node Foundation and the way that they are generating their meeting agendas. They have some tooling in place to bubble up any issues or PRs that happen to have a specific label associated with them. So last night I did some work around this. because this agenda, unfortunately, has not been getting put together in enough time to, I think, have the community get visibility on it, and for us to get a wider group coming to this meeting, which I think a lot of people would love the opportunity to be discussing these issues with us. So, so the idea here is that going forward, any issue or PR that you would like to, in the wild, get us to discuss at this call, if you add the label agenda to it, we will essentially surface that when we generate the meeting agenda going forward. And ideally, this agenda will now also get queued up on a cron job, so it's not going to be manually created by myself going forward. So that was just another sort of high-level note. There's still some work around having a lot of our projects extend from sort of our baseline settings that right now live in a project called the Open Source project, or Open Source Boilerplate project. Right now, that has all the labels that we agreed upon in another call that we'd like to be using across our projects. It has a settings YAML in there that we can share across our projects. So it's super easy for you to be keeping sort of a standard set of labels across every project. So yeah, so another to do for me, just to further lament that going forward, these agendas will be automatically generated. And if you want to remove something from the agenda, all you have to do is remove that label from the issue or PR. So this should make these calls go a lot smoother. Yeah, it's just a heads up. Any comments on that? Nope. Okay. Cool. So moving on to what essentially is our first real issue for the call. Again, unfortunately, I don't know if a lot of people have had time to review the various issues and PRs that have been bubbled up. This RFC is for essentially having yarn resolutions, which I believe is something that we've discussed about supporting in NPM 7. Although I don't know, Isaac, you'll be able to give some context here if that's actually right now on our roadmap to actually support something like this.
Yeah, I don't know that we have a like, I don't have a detailed spec or an issue for it, but certainly yarn resolutions is something that I'm considering and assuming that we'll do in NPM 7. Essentially, it goes with a handful of changes that we're planning, or implementation details that are planned for the arborist tree generation stuff, being able to look at more than just a package lock.json as the sole source of truth. So one of the design goals of Arborist and for NPM 7 is better interoperability with Yarn and PNPM. And so one of the key aspects of that is, we might not have a package lock JSON or an npm shrink wrap file. We might have a yarn lock file or a PNPM lock or some other thing, right? And so the plan is to, and also, as we discussed in our team meeting recently, as I'm going through some of the tree resolution and reifying stuff, there are some shortcomings with how the npm shrink wrap file can represent the package tree. So essentially, as we, again, discussed internally, the npm shrink wrap sort of data format, which is also the same as package lock JSON, can only represent, it represents the package tree, but it can only represent the package tree where it's sort of a consistent nested hierarchy of node modules package, right? And And it has the concept of like, this thing is a parent of this other thing. But what it doesn't have is this thing is a symlink to this other folder, and I'm going to actually, and that folder is within the node modules tree, but not within the kind of like nested node modules folders. So this is what you see with the trees that PNPM generates. It's also important if we're going to snapshot and capture the state of a workspaces directory. And there's additional information which a yarn lock file presents, and then information it doesn't present. So we kind of have this like overlapping, non-identical set of data that we can get from the various files. So the plan is to have Arborist be clever about pulling what information it can from a package lock JSON, from a yarn lock file, from resolutions, and from a PNPM log file, and turn that into a fully resolved representation of all of the packages within a given project. I suspect that we're going to end up with a somewhat different format for a lock file that Arborist will use to just kind of like capture the state of that resolution for performance reasons. And I don't suspect that we'll add a new thing that goes in your project, but more likely we'll capture that state in a new file that lives in node modules, somewhat like how PNPM stores its log file.
Right.
So yeah, doing resolutions as part of that is absolutely on the table. I don't think it's going to be that hard to kind of add that as a constraint when we're building the tree. It's just something we haven't done yet.
Would it be a blocker? So let's say, would it be a blocker? Like, would it have to be shipped under a major version, or could we change this to be?
Could we do resolutions in V6?
No, I'm saying in a 7.1.
Yeah, I don't think that adding resolutions is a breaking change itself. Okay. It's just a matter of, I mean, doing it in V6 would be pretty challenging given just the state of the installer code base.
But if we can move it down, like I'd like to update this specifically so that we can, we don't have, yeah, we can do it later and we don't have, yeah. And so it doesn't become blocking for us to get the initial workout for 7.
Right. Yeah, I think actually so it's kind of it's one of these cases where the feature itself is a minor, the feature itself is a non-breaking feature addition, but all the underlying work to support it is actually much harder, and is a breaking change. So we may find that yarn resolutions is like pretty easy to do, and we just fold it in because we have to do all the same. We have to do 90% of the work in order to land V7 anyway. But yeah, that thing itself, I wouldn't say is a blocker for 7. We can get it in a later minor update. We may end up doing it just because it's easy once we get there.
Okay, I've updated the ticket accordingly with the labels, and I think I'll leave it off the agenda for our next call then. Going forward, so number 14, fix up and improve status board. This essentially is just a backlog item for myself. I've already spoken to a bit how we're using this, so I'm actually going to remove this as an agenda item. So the status board essentially is bubbling up a number of metrics and sort of state of our projects. So I was working on that last night. And I can just essentially give a status update there. I still have like 5 or 6 major changes to make, but right now the agenda creation is script actually lives inside of the status board project. So once we open source that next week, that will be available to the wider public. So any future improvements will folks should be able to see and have visibility on. So yeah, what time should we run the Open RFC calls? Again, I think we've already covered this now. I have an action item, so I'll remove this as an agenda item. Number 7, add settings YAML file and extend from npm default. Michael, this is a backlogged issue for you. I'm not sure if you can speak to this. Has this already essentially happened? This work? It's
I think this is a true statement. Yeah. So the that internal repo already got, or I guess the repo's not internal. Already got renamed, and this was to add the settings YAML. So originally, the open source project boilerplate was supposed to extend the GitHub's the .github repo for the npm org, which means that the .github repo was supposed to be the base for everything. And currently we have, you can't nest extensions, or extending. So this particular repo would extend from the GitHub repo, and then you can't have like grandchildren of this one, basically. And currently we have ones that are extending this. So this is moot, I think, but then that kind of means that the settings file in here needs to be very well fleshed out. So this sort of changes from adding a settings file that extends from the defaults to like create a settings file that is the defaults. And then we're going to end up having 2 different repos that are in the npm org. Our .github one that everything will just extend from by default because it's called .github, and then this one that people can specifically switch their .settings file to if they. So for instance, all of our open source stuff could extend from this rather than the default, even though by virtue of existing in the npm org they get the default, and then you can just create the settings file to sort of pull something slightly different. It's actually a fairly good separation of concerns, I think, comparatively for like internal and open source public facing repos.
Yeah, I think the idea is to be a bit more surgical there and to slowly adopt those settings in the open source projects. I know that we did essentially inherit a whole bunch of settings when we created that .github project at the org level. Yeah, I think this is the right approach. So just as an action or takeaway, maybe you can update that issue to reflect the actual scope of the work. I know that we may be able to just close this, as it's going to be ongoing sort of improvements as we extend this baseline with all our open source projects. So yeah, not sure if you can just update that, and we can remove it from the agenda.
I'm not sure I fully understand what that is. Can you? Sorry.
Sure, I can give you some context, Daniel. So we at the org level ratified some baseline, baseline pull request templates. And so the engineering org then created a .github product, which essentially what that does is maps those templates across all of your projects. And you can override them at the per project level. So although we have some wants and needs from the sort of open source team that kind of deviate from that standard. So what we're looking at here is setting up our own defaults in the open source boilerplate project, and then slowly having our projects essentially adopt or extend from that as our standard. So that's sort of the approach I think that we're going to be taking. And also we may be going back at the engineering org meeting and asking to maybe take a step backwards with sort of full-on adoption of the .github folder may not be the right tool to essentially be doing, to be rolling out these sort of org-wide settings. shared settings, right? So yeah, it was kind of like we used I'm not sure what the analogy is, but you know, we were not as surgical as we could have been when we rolled this out. So
Thanks.
no problem. Okay, so moving on. Ad monitoring benchmarking tools. I think I added this as an agenda item just to essentially bubble up that this work is indeed happening, and maybe Michael, you can speak to the status of that work to like the broader audience.
Sure. So currently, we don't have, so we have 100% test coverage and test suites for the CLI, and we'd also like to include some benchmarking metrics so that we can see how quick our operations are. So we have a few scenarios defined, mostly around installing. So installing with no cache and no log file and no node modules folder, and then installing with a warm cache with no node modules and a log file, and then installing with a log file and no all the other things. So all these particular permutations rather. There is a project that PNPM started. I think it's PNPM / package manager benchmarking project or something like this. It basically runs each of the CLI or each of the package managers against a set of scenarios, which is pretty fantastic. So we wanted to adopt this kind of thing internally. So we are, I basically rejigged some of the boilerplate around the scenario so that it's a little easier to sort of define, I want you to run, this command with no cache, with no modules. Before it wasn't quite very clear what you were attempting to do in each of the scenarios. So now it's very easy to define like a scenario and then run a CLI tool or a package manager against that scenario. And yeah, so that'll land in the CLI tool first, which means that incoming pull requests will get sort of a notification in their pull requests or a commit message, not a commit message rather, but a comment sort of stating the results. That's sort of the V1 of this. V2 would be then you'd get a comparison and you'd be able to see all this in a sort of more bubbled up version, but in order to sort of avoid scope creep, we're sort of keeping it a little bit minimalistic, and then we can sort of expand on this later and be a little more iterative with it. And then hopefully we can create or either fork the PNPM one that's going on and adopt the same kind of boilerplate in it, or just sort of create another repo and adopt the same kind of scenario boilerplate so we can sort of run yarn and PNPM and yarn PNP and such against these particular scenarios. There's also, I think you mentioned the Pico or some other thing. I think
Pico.
Yeah.
Pico.
Yep. Is it Pico or
I don't
Pico?
think it's Pika Pack. I don't know if Pika really does installing or if it's just kind of a bundler and publisher.
It's just a bundler from what I read.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't think performance of publishing is really like not very high sensitivity, right? Like people generally don't complain that publishes take too long. They tend to complain that installs take too long, and rightly so, right? Because you're talking about several orders of magnitude in difference in terms of how much operations they have to do. And also you install much more frequently and many more people do it. So I don't know if benchmarking against Pika is really that valuable.
Well, all it is to say that the other repository would be able to, you can add arbitrary package managers to it.
Okay,
okay. The list of them is irrelevant, but the idea is that we have another thing that we can,
yeah, the main thing that I want out of this is, and even less even about benchmarking against PNPM and Yarn, but also I want to benchmark NPM 7 against NPM 6. So I want to be ready to do that because we're moving a lot of stuff around. So things could get a lot faster or a lot slower.
They're going one way. We know which way they're going.
It's unlikely to be the same in every scenario, right? We're doing a lot of things differently. So
correct. Okay, that was a great high level review, Michael. That's awesome. So we should see some movement on that soon. Okay, moving on, the add funding to package JSON issue. Again, this is pointing at essentially the status board tickets, unfortunately. So they aren't necessarily exposed to the wider org just yet. They will be next week. But maybe, Roy, you can speak a little bit to the status of adding funding to package JSON and the NPM fund subcommand. I know Isaac ratified that RFC, or essentially we sort of had consensus there that this was the right first step. Maybe you can speak to the implementation a bit and where it's at.
Sure. Yeah, maybe we can. I can also have calls if anyone wants to have the long explanation about the implementation itself. But basically, I try to follow examples of whatever I can, right? So to make sure that I don't get things too wrong. So basically, I took the list command as a sort of like a reference for trying to list all the tree of dependencies, and the repo command implementation as a baseline on how to open the browser, showing the funding URL that is described on the package JSON. So anyways, yeah, it's basically trying to get from the examples we have already in the CLI. And the RFC is pretty simple. We add a funding object to the package JSON. It has a type and a URL. So npm fund is going to be able to list all of the dependencies that has the funding field on it. And when you do npm install, it's going to have a little message showing you, okay, n numbers of package needs funding. So you can run npm fund and find more about it. So it's basically these three things: is npm install that shows the message, is npm fund listing all the dependencies, and npm fund at a package name that is going to open the default browser in the URL funding so that people can learn more about how to contribute.
And have you, I think you said that there's open PR now, or you've gotten that staged?
No,
almost
not yet, but I should be able to open it right after this call. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, great.
So yeah, so the work, but this is like kind of a first pass of the work, right? I'm pretty sure we'll have feedback and we can iterate. But yes, please take a look when the PR is open.
For sure. Awesome. Okay, moving on. Default template files for projects. I think this speaks again to the extension issue. So it's essentially a duplicate. I'm just going to remove it from the agenda for our next call. Unless, Michael, this is a bit different. I think it's essentially the same as the extension issue. Is that correct?
Sorry, say that one more time. Which
default template files for number 10 issue. Yeah, so I believe it's just
no, it's not quite the same. So the we didn't. So basically, the org sort of ratified some default templates, but those don't necessarily sit the same way they should for open source projects. And so this discussion around this issue was creating defaults specifically for open source projects because it's against the boilerplate. So if we get in a situation where the org has a default GitHub folder that's sort of extending, so by default, templates specifically get extended by virtue of that folder. So every repo underneath the org will by default get those templates. And so if we want to overwrite specifically in open source without having to like write templates for all those things, you can put them in here, and then those ones can have a settings folder that extends this, and then it'll overwrite those templates, which is kind of a nice layered separation of concerns. So the default templates in this particular org should be the ones we want for open source projects. It was basically what this issue is. So it not necessarily, so like the two, I just posted in the chat, but the issue that I just updated was specifically around fleshing out the settings file, which is to say, the repository settings need to be added. I added some detail there. This one is specifically around the templating because those two things, although they sound the same, aren't the same thing, right? Like that by virtue of it being called the .github repo, or by virtue of that repository being called .github, you extend templates across the entire org, but the settings in the settings YAML are only extended by virtue of extending them by using the settings YAML in other files. So one you get by default across org repos, the other one you have to like opt into. And all the open source projects that we want to make sure we have our correct settings for should actually extend this, and then they'll opt into this set of not only settings, but also templates.
That makes sense.
So similar thing, but different example of it.
Yeah.
Similar concept, but different implementation.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. They're not all just linked together, but yeah.
What are you gonna do?
GitHub does some magic for us.
Magic.
Yeah, the black magic that is GitHub.
Lots of magic.
I mean, it's nice that you can extend the stuff for an org anyway.
Well, yeah.
Okay. Moving on to PRs now. Isaac, I know that this has actually been on the agenda the last couple times we've met up, but you essentially had the domain knowledge and context. I know that you've locked this issue now, or the last, I know that we've sort of run in circles, had the same conversation a couple times. Maybe you can give a little bit of context, the state of it, and sort of how we're moving forward.
Yeah, so the reason why I locked it is that there's not much value in like just continuing to go back and forth on a disagreement. This is kind of the principle of loose consensus, right? The principle of loose consensus is we don't all have to agree, but it's important that we evaluate all disagreements. And at the point where we have done that, we're kind of done talking. And it's frequently not possible to make everyone happy, but we can certainly make sure that everyone's unhappiness has been seen. So when a discussion gets to a point where it's the same issue being brought up again and again, and somebody saying, well, I still disagree, then, okay, we're done talking. And I locked it because this issue is a little bit controversial. And we're at a point where we have all the data that we can possibly gather right now, right? Which is a handful of people think it's a bad idea. A larger number of people think it's a very, very good idea. We really are more, and it comes down to like who exactly is our constituency. I'm more concerned about the millions of people running npm install and React projects and having a warning or having something fail to work properly because of, after running npm install. I want it to work well for them. Now, it may be that there are some unforeseen issues that come out of this, or that some of the concerns that are brought up turn out to be a really big deal, in which case we'll flush that out. We'll shake that out during the beta process of npm v7. But like getting worked up over it at this point is a little unhelpful.
Yeah, and maybe you could speak to that in terms of, I know we haven't talked about it quite yet publicly, but like having some time to let that bake, like the next major version bake, may help ease people's pains.
Yeah. So the other thing is, where that may land. Like, so yes, I think that we should document what the beta process for v7 is going to look like. I don't, like with a 6.12.1, right? We landed a bunch of PRs and then we shipped it, and it's fine because it's like really low risk stuff. It's all patch changes, bug fixes and stuff. V7 is a breaking change. Now, in the past, we have had sometimes quite lengthy beta periods before a version of npm gets moved to the latest dist tag, before it gets shipped by default with Node. And so there's a very good chance that, the first v7 thing that the majority of people actually hit might be 7.3 or, so whatever. But if we want to have the option of installing pure deps by default, or doing some of the suggested fallbacks in that PR of saying, well, we're not going to install them by default, unless you opt into it, or unless you run this second command that will fill in your peer depths. The installer still needs to be aware, right? It needs to kind of like leave a hole there. If it's only a peer depth and we're not going to install it, we have to be able to install it later via some easy mechanism that doesn't require the user to sort of manually do this package resolution step with their human brain. So we have to do all the work to be able to install them by default, and let's just do that work, and then let's see how it goes. And if we need to roll that back and make it not a default or whatever, that's a relatively small bit of additional work. So I locked the issue because it's like we're going to talk about this again once we have an implementation, and we'll unlock it then. And also I said, you know, if anybody wants if anybody has a new issue that has not been addressed in this, then for sure let me know and I'll reopen it. We'll discuss it more. But if it's stuff that's already kind of been addressed and you just disagree, like, sorry, I'm, you know, not the boss of me.
Yeah.
not to be too flip about it, but like, you know, we've got a project to run, we got other stuff to do. So when we have an implementation to talk about, then we'll reopen it and we'll try to get people to start banging on it and see, like, you know, is this really the apocalypse that was projected, or is it the you know, the savior that all of our users hope it to be in the React land, or is it just kind of like, it's fine?
Yeah.
That's honestly, like, most of the time it's fine. It's not a big deal.
Okay.
So
cool. Well, I appreciate you going into detail there.
I can take an action item to at least like maybe pitch like what a documentation of what our rollout process should look like, but
I think we'll sort of speak to that on next Tuesday potentially. We'll at least have a couple points on when that timeline might drop, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think that's something we should probably just discuss as a team internally, and then share it.
Sounds good. You want to take an action item to queue that up, or I can do that to book some time for us internally.
I feel like that's a good use of
my time.
Skills rather than.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay, I'll take that away then.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes.
Yep. Okay, so moving on then, 36, allow script shell config in package JSON. Now this, again, Isaac, you had sort of talked about a blessed, the concept of like a blessed key, something like npm for like all this config to live. I'm not sure if you've had time to sort of like refresh your memory about this. It was from a couple months back. Not sure where we land on this, whether this needs further fleshing out of what that would look like, if we want to support it. Does it make sense to like backlog some work for this?
So I think this is a separate, what I sort of suggested here on August 19th in the comment on this is this is sort of a separate RFC, right? We're talking about the initial RFC is just, here's this one config option that I want to be able to set in package JSON so that I don't have to put it in a .npmrc file. And I'm like, okay, but why don't we just let you put configs in your package JSON instead of an npmrc file? Like, that seems to be a pattern that's really common. You know, TAP, NYC, Istanbul, like Babel, Jest, they all have stuff like this.
So should we just give that feedback and then we can change the topic or change the label to needs docs as well? So we can do that, and then I think the action would be just to give that feedback that it sounds like we should. I think you already did kind of provide that sort of direction.
Yeah, so I said you know, my main objection is that it seems weird to pick this config as the value as the only one to set in a project level config in package JSON. So I don't know if this is the best. You know, we should probably have a little bit of a bike shedding session on this. One objection that I could imagine is that it's a little weird to have a field in your package JSON called npm since kind of the whole file is for NPM, you know, it makes a little bit more sense for those other, like for TypeScript to do something like that. Since the rest of your package JSON is not for TypeScript. We might want to call it something like npm config or some other name, but that aside, it would essentially just be taking the place of a .npm project config, right? So we could implement this pretty easily in our config loading logic to say, you know, look for a .npm-rc file. If you don't find it, see if the package JSON has an npm field, which is an object, and then just that's your project config. We could also, another way to do it would be to say that this is essentially a second project config that can be used in addition to an npm-rc file, and then we need to figure out, okay, well, which one takes precedence, right? If you have a .npm-rc file and you also have an npm field in your package JSON, then which do you use?
Go ahead, Mike.
I'm confused at the point of this. So I don't mean to like continue the bike shedding, but it's just an extra file and it does the exact same thing. I don't know why it's necessary to have two different ways of doing the same thing.
You could have it like essentially that package metadata. Then there could be some use cases I could imagine.
The use case would be you don't want a .npm. The point of this removes a .npm-rc file, and so you don't want that .dot file in the tarball. Is the only reason I can think of not doing it.
Well, so the .npm-rc file won't show up in the tarball anyway, because we don't ship package configs in a package, which is actually important because you know you may have like secrets or passwords or tokens or whatever in there. It's pretty common. So even though that's a really bad idea.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea is that they want to get something that is useful in the npm-rc file because it's not in the tarball into the tarball.
It doesn't matter because we're not going to look at it in a nested folder anyway. Like if you're installing something, right? This is the initial push. The initial PR is just saying like I want to be able to specify the script or the binary that's used to run npm scripts in this package. So if you think about it, like you don't run the test script from a package you install.
Right.
You do run, now this gets interesting, you do run like post-install, pre-install, those kind of lifestyle.
So that's what I thought it was referring to, right? Like that's what I thought the scripts were for, all the pre-install and post-install, because I think those are only scripts you run on installation. But again,
there's a handful of them. But
if you cloned this repo and you ran to like install, you'd have a .npm-rc file, right? If you like npm installed this repo and you needed to run post-install scripts, then the .npm and RC wouldn't be there, right? And so then I understand, and then the scripting, like you're effectively trying to hoist config out of the .npm-rc file into to get it to run. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, that is interesting. So then this actually adds a pretty fascinating layer here, right? Because now what we're talking about is potentially using a different config set for running the package scripts of installed packages in node modules folders.
Yeah, is that not what the first objective of this was? That's what I just assumed. When else would you need to mess with the shell? You said something about testing just then, but
yeah, just when you run npm test, you know, it's forces an extra file which otherwise might not be necessary. Like they literally, the goal of this, or the kind of the impetus for this is just I want to have a script shell setting in package JSON. There's also some suggestions of having a different way to do it, putting it under the scripts object, and then also potentially swapping between different platforms. So This is a little bit of a Pandora's box, right? Like we may want to open it, but
yeah, what do we need to sort of like circle back on this conversation, and then what would be ideal to sort of like action items here, label properly or ask for specific input?
I think impact is one. So like Isaac, you just mentioned the post install, pre-install, whatever other scripts, and then all the testing stuff. Like that impact would need to be defined. And then I still struggle with the impetus, because if you want your test to run in a certain script, you just put in a .npmrc file. Like I don't know why you'd need to have an
right. Like, yeah, and I mean this is kind of the solution of like, yeah, if you don't, if you have an npmrc file and you don't want an npmrc file, you could fix that by not caring, right? Like, and that's a perfectly fine solution. I love problems that you can fix by not caring. They're so easy to fix. But no, the impact and where this gets interesting, yeah, like I hadn't really thought this through until just now, but do we or do we not respect that setting if it's nested within a package you're installing? And if so, it needs to be in package.json, right? And may actually need to be in the corgi as well, because we need to know that we have to run it. Right, so when we run the install script, we do that by pulling off the manifest and knowing that we have to kind of schedule that thing. I believe, I don't think we do a package.json read before that. The second thing is, do we add some like conditional configs? And that's a whole other kettle of fish, right? Like, do we want to say like, this is the config value if you're on Windows, this is the config value if you're on Darwin, right?
I think there's a separate issue for targets specifically. Our multi-entry points. Yeah, I think there's a multi-entry points issue that actually might even be on this agenda still. Might have got added. It may not actually have been added, sorry. But there is something out there.
Okay.
But yeah, just in terms of bookending this, just as we only have, I want to be mindful of time. You know, it sounds like there's some further thought that we could put behind where we could go with this, and whether or not this is something we could even potentially queue up.
So yeah, there's I think doing something special for script bin is not the right approach, right? That's not elegant, and it's going to set some user expectations that you can put other configs in there and then they won't work, and that's kind of weird. I'd rather have fewer one-off things for individual config values, individual config keys. So the two questions are like, do we add another config layer for installed packages or not? Because currently configs are the same for everything you're installing. And the second question is, do we want to open the door towards having conditional configs based on different versions? And if so, should we also just put that in the npmrc file format so you can have you know, like a Windows block that overrides everything on Windows and a Unix block or whatever. And then how do we want to represent that in package.json if we use package.json for config? So
do you want to kick up those questions or discussions in an issue on the RFC project? I feel like essentially what you just outlined there are two good questions we should surface, and it sounds like this RFC as it stands today is something that we don't want to move forward with. That's sort of
correct,
right?
Yeah.
It would have to be drastically changed for it to, right? So, okay. So action items there is just give that feedback and then say that we've moved the discussion to asking some questions about how we'd want to move forward with something that's more holistic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are you okay with creating that issue and asking that question?
I will create that issue.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more. Given the fact that there was so many PRs pulled up from this automation that I ran, Is there any specific one on here, the last, I think, 6 that we had, that somebody wanted to speak to? I can essentially, at a high level, go over some of the interesting ones. Are singleton packages? Is that something we want to look into? Pika pack, pulling that into NPM was a discussion that was brought up a long time ago. I'm not sure if we want to essentially say we are doing that or not doing that. That was the essentially the next agenda item. If not something specific, then we can go into the Pika pack, make it available in NPM. So there hasn't been a lot of movement on this. And I believe this is mostly kicked off by former folks that were here. Isaac, and I'm sure if you have any thoughts around this.
Sorry, I got distracted looking at singleton packages.
No problem. We can skip this. It's number 35.
Pika pack.
Yeah.
Pika has continued to, be add new features and do interesting things. And in the meantime, I feel like we have a lot on our plate, and we should let Pika keep growing and becoming, and pull it in or evaluate that post NPM 7. I don't know if anybody else wants to take it on and evaluate it. That's totally fine by me, but time.
I echo Isaac's sentiment. I think this is something we kick down the road to after NPM 7.
Okay, I've added the label backlog for now, and also going to add a major, some verb major. I believe that would be appropriate. And needs discussion is still labeled there. Okay, moving on. RFC for pull request number 34, RFC for dependencies change script addition. So this was an interesting proposal. This was essentially like a hook, a lifecycle hook for when your dependencies have changed, essentially allowing people to create tooling around auditing or verification or anything like that. And not sure where we've sort of netted out and whether this is something we would want to like pull back in and move forward with.
Yeah, I think this is something that should be relatively easy to do in NPM 7. I wouldn't make it, we should bike shed the name a little bit. Like, we don't currently use camel casing in names, and post and pre kind of have a magic meaning in script names.
I think in some of the discussion there was a just change and post change, I believe, and it was just all lowercase. Right.
So then we would have like pre-change as well, and then the question becomes like, when exactly do we run that script, and what information does it have available to it? So there are some things where like there is no pre, or if there is, it can't actually do anything. It doesn't have access to stuff like pre-pack. Doesn't yet know, I believe, what version it's or what the file name is going to be. Yeah, we would just need to outline like exactly when in the tree resolution and reification process that actually happens, and what it can do. My thinking is, what you'd really want, or what I would want if I was going to target the use case described in that PR, I would want to know before we install it, right? I would want to know before the change actually happens, like what was the old version, what is the new version, and what's the metadata, and be able to get at that in that script somehow, so that I could check and see, like, has the license changed? Does it still have a license file, or what have you? And maybe even do some asynchronous work to check and make sure that, like, if it's something that we need a license exemption, if it's a a paid license or something like that, we're still in good standing. So there's a little bit more bike shedding to be done. I don't see this landing prior to NPM v7.
Okay.
Could, but it's going to be like an order of magnitude more work to do it that way. So I would punt it for now.
Yep. I've flagged accordingly just now based on that. So, but it's definitely something that I think ties into some of the work that we're doing with the funding, or like as more support work lands, or as we talk about that more, I think this would be useful to do something around this for sure.
Right.
Just to be mindful of time, we're pretty much at time now. So anything
I want to comment sure. Real quick. PR20, the PowerShell scripts with installed binaries, we actually did implement this. I didn't realize there was a PR when I landed that. Or I didn't realize there was an RFC when I landed that. But it got into CMD shim version 2.1, and then that shipped with NPM 6.11. So I moved that to the implemented folder in RFCs and closed the PR.
Yep. I think that's why I actually had it on there, was to see that we actually followed up on there, because I did notice that you said that. So it's great that we're landing that stuff. So so you've pulled that in now? Or
yeah, I moved the RFC to the implemented folder.
Okay. So we can close out that conversation then. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining again. Anything we weren't able to get to, we'll punt and hopefully have some async conversations offline. And again, I'll follow up with everybody offline. Thanks so much.